Have you ever experienced a moment that seemed to stop time? An instant when everything you've built, believed, and hidden for decades simply crumbles before a single glance? That night was exactly like that for me. The night the police caught me with him in the car. And what struck me most wasn't the flashing red lights in the rearview mirror, nor the screams, nor the public humiliation. It was the face of the man who got out of the car, the police officer's face, the same man I loved 30 years ago. There's no explaining what happens inside someone when past and present collide so forcefully. It's like the air is knocked out of them. The body reacts, but the mind takes a while to understand. I stood there, frozen, caught between fear and memory, trying to breathe as he pointed the flashlight straight into my eyes. For a second, I didn't know if I was about to be arrested, or if I was about to relive the love that had shaped my entire life. But before I tell you what happened, that morning I need to take you with me to where it all began, because no story is born of scandal. The ones that truly matter are born of silence, the kind of silence that imposes itself when you need to hide who you are, when love is dangerous, and desire becomes a secret that burns inside. In the 1980s, I was just a kid trying to survive in a world that didn't know what to do with people like me. The streets seemed narrower, conversations more closely monitored, and any unusual gesture could get you condemned. And it was in this context that I met him. I won't say his name because names matter less than looks. And his said everything that mouths couldn't. He was different. He had that kind of presence that commanded respect. But his gaze revealed what the world couldn't know. We met at school, and from the first day, there was something, a curiosity, a strange energy, something I pretended not to see, but that drew me back whenever I tried to forget. There were months of shy approaches, casual conversations, quick glances in the hallway, until the day everything spiraled out of control. I remember the first time we were alone. It was a summer afternoon, in an empty field behind the school. The heat was stifling, and the light seemed to gild everything. He looked at me and said something simple, almost banal. "Have you ever thought about leaving here?" And before I could answer, silence did the rest. It was the first touch, the first kiss, the first fright, not out of fear of him but of the world, of what they would say, of what they might do. Because back then, loving another man wasn't just a source of shame, it was a source of danger, and he knew this better than I did. His father was a police officer, strict, hardline. He grew up hearing that a real man doesn't feel, doesn't cry, doesn't bow down. And yet, there he was, looking at me as if time had stopped, as if, for an instant, the whole world could be different, but the world didn't. The weeks that followed were filled with guilt and secrecy. We met in secret, feigning friendship, exchanging quick glances, feigning naturalness in front of others. It was a love made of gaps, brief, intense, and doomed. And even though we knew it couldn't last, we persisted. Because when you find someone who truly sees you, the risk doesn't matter. Until one day, he disappeared. Without warning, without explanation, he just vanished. And what remained was a silence that lasted decades. Tried to move on. I hid behind a routine, a job, a normal life. I learned to smile when people asked about relationships. I learned to pretend when my heart sank. This is how many of us learn to live, in pieces, to fit in with what's expected of us. 30 years had passed. I was already a gray-haired man bearing the marks that time leaves on those who have learned to swallow their own truths. I no longer expected reunions, nor redemptions, until that night. It was late. The warm city air clung to my skin, and the radio played an old song, the kind that reminds us of what we've pretended to forget. He was beside me in the car, laughing lightly, perhaps a little drunk, and for a moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, peace. But peace sometimes lasts only a short time. The red lights appeared in the mirror, the screams followed soon after, and in seconds, what had been tranquility turned to panic. "Get out of the car!" they shouted. The lights flickered. Neighbors began to appear at the windows. The shame, the fear, the feeling that everything I had tried to build, discretion, respect, care, was about to crumble. I got out of the car, my hands raised, gasping for air. The ground was cold under my feet. My heart was racing. And that was when I saw him, the police officer, the face behind the flashlight. The same look, only now tired, hardened by the years. 3 decades later, and there he was, the man I'd loved silently, now in uniform and with a badge. For a second, I couldn't tell if fate was playing a trick on me or if life had decided to exact everything from me all at once. He froze. The voice that had been giving orders to the others faded. We stared at each other, saying nothing. Time dissolved there. I could see in his eyes the same astonishment, the same pain, and something else, a silent regret, an old fear, a repressed desire. The sirens continued, but for me the world had stopped, and that's where the story truly begins. Because what happened after that night changed everything, not just for me, but for him too. Sometimes fate doesn't want to punish you. It wants to bring you face to face with what you left behind, to see if you finally have the courage to face it. Before we move on to the next part of this story, I want to ask you something, and it's important. If this first part caught your attention, if at any point you felt something different, a lump in your throat, an old memory coming back, leave your like here now. This really helps the channel continue to grow and shows me that stories like this still need to be told. And more than that, comment below what you felt so far. I really want to know. Sometimes, what we experience, what we carry in silence, is also experienced by others. And when you comment, you not only share, but you help someone who will read and think, I'm not alone. Take advantage and subscribe to the channel because here, every story is told with soul, with emotion, with truth. And what comes next will move you even more. Now that you've done that, take a deep breath, because what happens after that look between me and the police officer is something that took me a while to believe myself. He said my name, and the sound of his voice cut through the years like a blade. For an instant, everything around me disappeared. The red lights, the shouts, the curious crowd. Only that moment remained. The police officer, the man who had once looked at me with love, and now looked at me with fear. A fear I knew well, because it had once been mine too. The other officers sensed the tension, exchanged strange glances, and he, trying to hide it, lowered his voice. He asked me to step aside, to show him my documents, as if this were just another routine stop. But I could see the tremor in his hands he was trying to hide. The lights flickered on the wet asphalt, reflecting off the windows of the houses, and I could feel the weight of the gazes of the people around me. It was the kind of scene that destroys reputations. I knew that the next day, it would be the talk of the street. They caught him with another man in the car. The phrase would sound like a sentence. And the most ironic thing was that, of all the people in the world, the one there to expose me was precisely him. The same man who once promised me that, if life ever separated us, he would be the first to look for me. And there he was, in uniform, with a blank stare, as if he didn't know me. But I knew that look. Behind the rigid posture, the authoritative voice was the same boy who held my hand for the first time, hidden behind a wall, his heart pounding so hard it sounded like a drum. It was impossible to forget. The memory came back so clearly that for a moment I was no longer on that street, but back in that distant summer, when love was an act of courage and fear at the same time. The other man in the car with me tried to say something, but I raised my hand, telling him not to. I needed silence to understand what was happening. The officer told me to wait, said something to his colleagues, and walked away, gesturing for me to follow him to a darker corner of the street. I obeyed, not out of fear of authority, but out of a need for answers. When we were alone, he took off his cap, ran a hand through his short hair, and looked at me like someone trying to recognize a face in a foggy mirror. "Is that really you?" he asked, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. I couldn't answer. I just shook, my head unsure whether to smile or cry. And that's when I noticed his eyes were watering. He looked away, took a deep breath, and said, "You shouldn't be here." That sentence hit me like a punch. I wanted to ask what he meant by here. Here. Where? On this street? In this life? In this body? Or here, in his line of sight, reminding him of everything he'd tried to erase? I remained silent, waiting for him to say something more, but he just stood there, staring at the ground, with the expression of a man carrying decades of guilt. The silence between us was interrupted by the blare of radios and his colleagues calling for him. He composed himself, took a deep breath, and within seconds, the officer returned to the man's position. He said everything was resolved, that there would be no report, that I should go away and take care of myself. The words sounded gentle but cold. It was his way of trying to fix something without having to face the damage. I walked back to the car, in silence, still stunned. The guy with me looked at me blankly. "Did you know him?" he asked. I simply replied, "I did," and started the car. But the truth is I didn't know him anymore. Or maybe I knew him too well. That night didn't end when I got home. In fact, that's where it began. I couldn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of that encounter. The sound of his voice, his gaze, the way he tried to protect me by disguising himself, but also the way he hurt me again by pretending nothing existed. And it was in that conflict that I realized, some ghosts don't come back to haunt you. They come back to test you, to see if you still run, or if you finally decide to face them. I spent the next day trying to feign normalcy. I made coffee, read the newspaper, swept the porch, but everything felt out of place. The city seemed smaller, the air heavier. Around every corner I saw reminders of what I'd tried to forget. It was as if the universe had decided to remind me that certain stories, no matter how deeply you bury them, continue to breathe underground, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And that afternoon, as the sun began to set, I received a text from an unknown number. "Can I see you today?" the text said. I knew who it was before I even read the name. My heart raced. I considered ignoring it, but something inside me told me it was time to listen to what had been stuck in time. We met in a secluded cafe, the kind of place where no one recognizes you and conversations are lost amid the clatter of cutlery. When he entered, he was no longer wearing his uniform. He was wearing a simple shirt, unshaven, and a tired expression. He was an aging man, but still with that same look in his eyes, the look that once made me believe the world could be less cruel. He sat across from me and took a while to speak. He ordered a coffee but barely touched the cup. I watched his nervousness, the way he fidgeted with his hands, the way he avoided my gaze. And when he finally opened his mouth, the words came like a sigh. "You don't know how many times I've dreamed of this moment, but I never imagined it would be like this." There was a heavy silence between us. He looked out the window and continued. "That night, seeing you there, it was like time going back. I spent 30 years trying to convince myself that what we lived through wasn't real, that it was a thing of youth, of confusion, of a time long gone. But when I saw you, it all came back, and I realized that what I pretended to forget never went away." His words left me breathless. I didn't know whether to feel anger, compassion, or sadness. Part of me wanted to get up and leave. Another part wanted to hear every detail, like someone who needs to understand their own wound in order to heal it. He spoke about the life he'd built, his marriage, his children, his career. He said he followed the path expected of him, but never felt whole. "I've accomplished everything the world has asked of me," he said, "but I haven't lived anything that was truly my own." I listened to him in silence, and as he spoke, I realized how cruel time is to those who choose to hide. There was no longer arrogance, no uniform, no authority. There was just a tired man trying to apologize without knowing where to begin. He looked me in the eye and asked, "Do you hate me?" I took a deep breath before answering. "No," I said, "but I also don't know if I still believe what you say." The words hung in the air between regret and the past. He lowered his gaze, and in that instant I realized that the man who had once been the source of my pain also carried his own prison. And this is where stories become truly human, when you discover that even the people who hurt you were also trying to survive. If you're listening to me so far, I want you to comment on the word "true" down here, because only those who have the courage to face the past can understand that sometimes the truth doesn't hurt. It sets you free. He stared at me as if trying to measure the time between two lives, and perhaps that was precisely what separated us in that cafe. Time. 30 years of silence, of wrong choices, of words never spoken. The sound of the clock hanging on the wall was the only thing breaking the heavy air between us. I tried to decipher that aged face, that weary gaze. The man who once promised me the world now seemed to carry its weight on his shoulders, and for a moment, I didn't see a police officer, nor the man who hurt me. I saw someone trying to find themselves within their own regret. He started talking again, this time in a low voice, almost a lament. He said that after he left me, he thought he was doing the right thing, that he needed to get his life together, to be the exemplary son, the respectable man, the kind of person who doesn't give anyone any reason to talk about him on street corners. I believed I would forget you, he said. But what we went through stayed trapped inside like a wound that never quite healed. He pointed to his chest and looked away as if afraid to look at me again. I took a deep breath and tried to remain calm. Part of me wanted to explode, throw everything I'd been through in his face. The sleepless nights, the fear, the feeling of being left behind as if it were a mistake. But another part of me, perhaps the more mature, the one shaped by time, just wanted to listen. Because when the past comes back, it doesn't want explanations. It wants closure. He kept talking, each word seeming forced out. He said that after becoming a police officer, he tried to erase what he had been. He lived by the rules, hiding behind his uniform, using authority as a shield. He said that in every person he arrested, in every life he judged, there was a piece of him trying to prove he was still man enough. His voice cracked, and his gaze wavered between regret and shame. I remember asking, "And you succeeded?" He frowned, as if, he didn't understand. "You succeeded in being the man the world wanted?" He lowered his head and murmured, "I succeeded in being everything they expected, except me." That sentence struck me strangely, because for years I too tried to be someone else. I worked hard, earned respect, but never allowed myself to truly live. We were both, in different ways, prisoners of the same fear. He chose the uniform. I chose silence. And in the end, neither of us won. He began to cry, silently, without making a fuss. He tried to hide it, but the tears fell slowly. And even though I had reasons to turn my face away, I couldn't. That crying wasn't just his. It was for everything we were and didn't have the courage to be. He leaned against the table, his shoulders shaking, and said, "I destroyed the only thing that was true in my life." That man with the firm voice, who had once humiliated me in front of others, now seemed small. And what I felt wasn't revenge. It was compassion, because I understood in that moment that prejudice doesn't just destroy those who suffer. It also destroys those who practice it. He'd spent all these years trying to prove something to a world that, in the end, doesn't care. A world that applauds disguise but ignores suffering. I asked him to stop making excuses. I told him that what's done is done, that I no longer needed excuses, but maybe a little truth. I asked if he'd ever forgotten me, and he, without hesitation, replied, "No, I just learned not to say your name." The answer was simple, yet devastating. It said everything. His fear, his guilt, his cowardice, and also, somehow, the love that had survived hidden. We sat in silence for a while, unsure of what to make of it, two people trapped between what they were and what they could have been. He said that in recent years he'd begun to change. He said the birth of his granddaughter made him rethink his life, his beliefs, and the truths he held dear. "I don't want her to grow up in a world where love is a reason to hide," he said. And I saw sincerity in his words. I saw a man who, even though he was late, wanted to fix what he'd broken. The sun was already setting when he reached across the table and said, his voice trembling, "I still owe you an apology." I looked at that aged, scarred hand and realized that this might be the most honest gesture he'd ever made toward me. I said nothing. I just held it. For a moment, the coffee disappeared. The noise of the people faded, and time returned to doing what it does best, uniting what seemed lost. I don't know how long we stood there, speechless, just staring at each other. It was as if that handshake concluded a story that fear had interrupted, but there was more. Something he still needed to say, and I could tell by the way he was breathing, like someone preparing for a confession. "There's something you need to know," he said. "Something I've kept hidden for all these years." I fell silent, my heart racing. He looked at me and added, "Back then, I wasn't the one who decided to leave. They made me leave." Those words washed over me like a storm. I stared at him, trying to understand. "How did they make you?" I asked, unable to contain my voice. He looked away, ran his hands over his face, and said, "My father found out, and when he found out, he gave me two choices: disappear or be exposed. I was young, a coward, and I chose to disappear. In that moment, everything made sense. The disappearance, the silence, the lack of explanation. He hadn't abandoned me. He'd been ripped from me, and worst of all, he'd carried that guilt for 30 years. I couldn't say anything. I just stared, feeling a mixture of anger, relief, and pain. He lowered his head and whispered, "I never meant to hurt you, but I didn't know how to fight it. Fight the fear, fight everything. That confession didn't erase the past, but it explained the scars. And it was there that I realized that forgiveness sometimes isn't born from what we want, but from what we understand. The waiter approached to close the bill, and reality returned. He stood up, hesitant, as if unwilling to end the conversation. "Can I see you again?" he asked. I looked at him, saw the same look from 30 years ago, and replied, "Yes," because deep down I knew that story wasn't over yet. There was something that time still needed to reveal. If you got this far, comment the word destination, because sometimes destiny doesn't separate, it just waits for the right moment to unite what fear has destroyed. He reached out to me again a few days later, this time not by message, not with apologies. He showed up. He knocked on my door with the same silence of someone carrying the weight of a lifetime. When I opened it, for a second, time seemed to repeat the scene from 30 years ago. The same look, the same nervousness in his hands, but a face that now revealed everything time demands when we live running from ourselves. I let him in, without saying a word. Sometimes silence is the only language the past understands. He stood in the room for a while, looking at the paintings, the books. My routine transformed into a memory. I knew he was trying to imagine who I'd become without him, and part of me I also wanted to know who he was now without us. The air was thick, heavy, filled with everything that was never said, and it was he who broke the silence, saying, "I didn't come to justify myself. I came to tell you what's stuck with me." We sat across from each other, like someone preparing for a reckoning that time has postponed for too long. He began speaking slowly, each word seeming to be wrenched from his chest. He told me how his father died without ever apologizing. He said he spent years trying to be the man that old man wanted, and that when he finally realized he was living someone else's life, it was too late. "I spent half my life afraid of being found out," he confessed, "and the other half, afraid of never being loved again." Those words echoed in my mind, because that's what fear is. It holds you captive, even when no one else is chasing you. It makes you hide, makes you wear masks until you forget the face beneath. And seeing that man, now broken, made me understand something that took me a long time to accept. Prejudice doesn't end when the other person forgives you. It ends when you forgive yourself for having survived it. He talked about the marriage, about the lies, about how guilt ate at him every time he looked at the woman he'd never truly loved. "She deserved a whole man," he said, his voice breaking, "but I only gave her half." And in that moment, I realized he was more than regretful. He was tired of pretending, of fighting, of carrying a name that time had turned into a disguise. We were silent for a few minutes. Outside, the rain was beginning to fall slowly, as if the world wanted to hear it too. I got up, poured 2 cups of coffee, and sat down again. This time closer. The smell of coffee mingled with the wet earth, and the sound of the rain seemed like a kind of comfort. He smiled slightly, a shy, sad, but sincere smile. "I've dreamed of this so many times," he said. "Being here, being able to look you in the eyes without having to hide." That confession unlocked something inside me. It was as if time had waited for that very moment to give me back what it had taken. It was no longer the reckless, lust-filled love of youth. It was something calmer, more human, born of the understanding of 2 people who had already been beaten too much by life. And for a few minutes I forgot what had happened on that street. The humiliation, the fear, the police car lights. All that remained was the present, and in it, only what was still alive existed. He told me that in recent years he'd considered retiring. He said his work no longer made sense. "I always thought I was serving justice," he said, "but I realized I spent my life judging others, so I wouldn't have to judge myself." That sentence dismantled me, because deep down it was a portrait of an entire generation, men taught to repress, to harden, to hide their feelings so as not to appear weak. But the truth is that what destroys us isn't what we feel. It's what we stop feeling for fear of feeling wrong. I asked if he'd told anyone about us. He denied it. "I never had the courage," he replied. "But every time someone talked about love, you were the one who came to mind." And then I realized that no matter how far he'd drifted away, I'd never stopped living in the quietest part of him, the part no one sees, but which decides the course of a person's life. The conversation grew more intimate, lighter, almost as if we were rebuilding what time had destroyed. He began to laugh at some memories. The first kiss, the fear of being caught, the letters hidden inside books. And for a moment, we were back to who we were, two boys trying to discover the world and their own hearts. Only now, old enough to understand that love, when it's true, doesn't fade. It just changes form. Night fell without us realizing it. He said he had to go, but he stood at the door, hesitant, like someone afraid to end something they've waited their whole life to resume. I approached and said, "We've waited too long to be afraid now." He smiled, stepped forward, and hugged me. A long, firm hug, the kind that requires no explanation. I felt his heart pounding, just like before, and realized that time can change everything, the body, the face, the manner, but it doesn't change what's real. When he pulled away, there were tears in his eyes. "I thought I'd never feel this way again," he said. I replied, "No one forgets what's real. They just try to hide it." He promised to return, and for the first time I believed him. There was something different about him, something more human, more sincere. Maybe it was regret, maybe it was love, or maybe it was just the knowledge that time doesn't give back what we waste. I closed the door and stood there for a few minutes, feeling the silence fill the house. That same silence that had once been solitude now felt like an invitation. Something inside me was rekindled, an old flame that time hadn't completely extinguished. I knew this story was far from over, that there were more truths, more wounds, more forgiveness to be brought to the table. But for the first time, I was ready to hear it all, without anger, without shame, without rushing. Because when you spend half your life hiding, you learn that freedom doesn't come from a grand gesture. It comes from the moment you allow yourself to exist, fully, without apologizing. If you got this far, comment the word courage, because it takes courage to face the past, to open the door to what once hurt you and say, "Now, I can hear you without fear." I want to see how many of you still believe that love, even late, still has the power to heal. He returned. He did what he said. There was no warning, no message, no phone call, just the discreet sound of the doorbell on a random afternoon, as if time had chosen that exact moment to continue what it had started. When I opened the door, he was there, with the same calm, tired look. But now there was something different, a serenity I didn't remember seeing before. He seemed lighter, as if he'd finally let some stones out of his pocket. I let him in, and again, silence settled between us. But this time, it was a good silence, a silence of someone who no longer needs to hide it. He took off his coat, looked around and commented on the plants, the smell of coffee wafting from the kitchen. I offered him a cup and he accepted with a shy smile. The simple, everyday gesture seemed to carry something greater, as if, after decades, life was finally allowing us to experience what was once forbidden. We sat facing each other, with that coffee steaming between our hands, and for a few seconds, I forgot everything. I forgot the humiliation, the nights I cried alone, the crooked glances. In that moment, there existed only two men who had once loved each other, and who, despite everything, still recognized each other. He began to speak, with that low, controlled tone of someone who still measures his words. But this time there was sincerity, not fear. He said that since our last meeting, something in him had changed, that he'd started dreaming again, remembering things he'd tried to erase. He said he'd walked through places we used to go, and that in each one he felt the same thing, a mixture of peace and pain. "It's like I've left a part of myself on every corner," he said, and I understood perfectly what he meant. Talking about the past is easy when it seems distant, but when it breathes again near you, it's different. The memory gains scent, voice, texture, and there, listening to him speak, I realized that love, even after aging, still has the power to revive what time has tried to bury. He asked me if I hated him. I took a deep breath before answering. He said that hatred requires energy I no longer had, that time has taught me that holding on to anger is the same as remaining trapped. He looked at me with a sad smile and said, "You've always been stronger than me." I shook my head. "No," I said. "I just learned to accept myself first." His gaze drifted to the window. The sun streamed in sideways, and for the first time, the silence between us felt like an embrace. There was no pressure, no guilt, just the feeling that somehow we were forgiving each other without needing words. After a while, he pulled something out of his pocket, an old, yellowed photo with frayed edges. It was the two of us, still teenagers, smiling in a way that time has never duplicated. I didn't remember that photo. He explained that he'd kept it hidden all these years in a book his father would never open. She was what kept me sane, he said. Every time I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I looked at her and remembered that I was once happy. I stared at that image for a while. It was strange to see myself so young, so naive, so full of future, and at the same time, painful to know what would come next. But there was also beauty there, proof that love existed, that we were real, that no lie could erase what we lived. The conversation continued, and at some point, he started laughing, a light, almost childish laugh. He said he was learning to cook, that he struggled in the kitchen, but found it amusing. He said his youngest son visited him occasionally and that his granddaughter loved playing with his dog. She's beautiful, he said. She has the same curious look you had. I laughed, and that comment, simple and sincere, shattered me inside. It was as if time had come full circle. The past now existed within the present, in a way that hurt but healed. At one point, he looked at me with a look I recognized immediately. It was the same as before, the look of someone who wants to say something but fears what comes next. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. "Of course." He took a deep breath, as if preparing to walk through a dark tunnel. "That night, when I saw you in that car, I wanted to stop time. I wanted to protect you, but I was also afraid. Afraid of what others would think, afraid of what I myself would feel again. That was the moment I realized that the love I hid never died. It just lay dormant." His words pierced me in a way no memory could. Because when someone says love never died, even after so long, it's not just romanticism. It's a confession. It's the recognition that the heart doesn't obey conventions. I didn't know what to say. I just rested my hand on his and let the silence speak for me. The afternoon passed slowly. The rain that had started falling earlier now turned into a light drizzle, and the sound of it tapping against the window seemed to match the mood between us. He looked outside and said, "Funny, I spent half my life wanting to forget, and now I just wish I could remember everything." We stayed like that for a while, unhurried, and it was there in that simple moment that I understood what it truly means to find someone again. It's not about reconnecting with what ended. It's about realizing that even what was lost is still part of who you are. Before leaving, he asked me to walk with him. I put on my coat and we set off together. The streets were wet, the wind chilly, but there was something warm in the air, perhaps the recognition that even as we grew older, we were still essentially the same. We walked side by side, in silence, until we reached the end of the street, where the asphalt ended and the dirt road began. He stopped, looked up at the dark sky and said, "If I had stayed, do you think we would have worked out?" The question hung between us, unanswered. I thought for a few seconds before saying, "I don't know, but I think we would have tried, and that would have been enough." He nodded with a wistful smile, and we continued walking. As we walked back, I felt a strange lightness, as if the weight of all those years was finally beginning to lift. With each step, a piece of the past seemed to dissolve, and in its place came a peace I'd never felt before. When we got home, he thanked me. He said he didn't know what he expected to find, but that he left feeling more human. "You reminded me of who I was before fear," he said. I smiled and replied, "And maybe it's time to remember who you can still be." He left that night, but I knew he'd come back. Not because he had to, but because there was still something unfinished between us. If you got this far, comment the word reborn, because sometimes, after a lifetime of hiding, all we need is a second chance to be who we've always been. The following week he returned, and he brought no apologies, no promises. He brought a simple cake, bought at the corner bakery, and the shy demeanor of someone wanting to start over, without asking permission. When he opened his mouth, it was to say, "Today marks exactly 31 years since that summer." I looked at him, and for a moment, I felt time double in on itself. That number wasn't just a reminder, it was a scar, the symbol of how much time can separate and at the same time, unite. We sat at the table, broke the cake, and reminisced about things only memory can preserve. The places we hid, the muffled laughter, the constant fear of being seen. And between sips of coffee, I noticed something curious. He remembered details I'd already forgotten. The color of the shirt I wore, the smell of the soap my mother used to put on my clothes, even the way I curled my fingers when I was nervous. He remembered it all, and that somehow moved me more than any apology. As the hours passed, the conversation deepened. He said he'd been thinking about leaving the city, selling the house, and moving to a place where he could breathe without the weight of the past. He said he'd already retired and now just wanted to live in peace. But before I go, I needed to see you one more time, he added. It felt like a goodbye, and for a moment, I felt the old fear return, the fear of loss, the fear of silence, the fear of reliving it all over again. I asked if he was running away again. He laughed, that short, sad laugh, and replied, "Not this time. Now I just want to live without hiding." And it was then that I realized that perhaps what he was looking for wasn't a new city, but a new beginning within himself, a place where he could finally exist without fear. He told me that after we met again, he decided to tell part of the truth to his eldest son. He said he trembled as he spoke, afraid of rejection, but his son simply replied, "Dad, what you've experienced is part of your story. I just want you to be happy." When he repeated those words, his voice broke, and I saw the tears he'd held back threaten to fall. This man who had once been ashamed of himself was now crying unapologetically, and I knew that in that moment he was finally breaking free. We sat in silence for a while, and in that silence I realized that forgiveness doesn't come suddenly. It comes gradually, like a light rain that begins to fall without us even realizing it. Every gesture, every word, every encounter, all of it was forgiveness happening in small doses. He began to look out the window, watching the drops run down the glass. He said that for years he had looked up at the sky and felt angry at God. "I thought he had punished me for loving wrongly," he said, "but now I understand that the mistake was never love, it was fear." That hit me in a way I hadn't expected, because deep down, it was the phrase I wished I had said myself, the phrase that sums up the lives of so many men who have been taught to be ashamed of their feelings. I told him that I also needed time to understand this, that I spent much of my life trying to prove the opposite of who I was, just to fit into other people's expectations. I said I learned the hard way that loneliness isn't the price of being different, it's the price of trying to be what the world wants. He listened silently, nodding slowly, and when I finished, he simply said, "So we wasted the same amount of time trying to erase each other." That sentence hung between us. It was simple, but it carried the weight of 3 decades. He stood, walked over to the shelf, and began looking through my books. He picked one up, opened it to a random page, and read aloud, "Some loves don't ask for eternity, just a chance to exist." He smiled and said, "I think that's what we're doing now." I walked over, took the book from him, and closed it. "No," I said. "I think we're doing what we should have done back then, choosing ourselves." He was silent for a few seconds, and after a while, he murmured, "You always had more courage than me." Maybe he was right, or maybe I just got tired of running. What matters is that in that moment, I knew that life could still be generous, even to those who took a while to understand what they deserved. He asked me to go for a walk again, and I did. The streets were wet, the cold wind bit my face, but there was a strange calm in the air. We walked side by side, sometimes in silence, sometimes laughing at old memories. We passed an empty square and he stopped suddenly. He looked at me and said, "You know what's funny? I thought seeing you again would be a punishment, but now I see it was a gift." Those words broke me, because in a way I felt the same way. Sometimes fate seems cruel, but deep down, it's just trying to give us back what we left behind. We walked home slowly, as if we didn't want the day to end. He said goodbye at the door, but before leaving, he looked at me for a long time. "Can I ask you something?" he asked. "Yes." He took a deep breath and said, "If I leave, promise me you'll live, that you won't hide anymore." I promised, not with words, but with a look that said, "I've already started." When he left, I stood there standing in the doorway, watching his figure retreat through the drizzle. The car's headlights illuminated the path, and for a moment, everything seemed suspended. My heart felt calm, light, as if I'd finally understood that some stories don't need happy endings. They just need truth. I walked in, closed the door, and sat on the couch, the scent of coffee still in the air. I picked up the book he'd been reading and opened it to the same page. The sentence was there, staring back at me like a mirror. "Some loves don't ask for eternity, just a chance to exist." And I realized that maybe the love hadn't come back to last, but to remind me that I was still alive. If you got this far, comment the word freedom, because that's what this story represents. The freedom to be, to feel, to forgive, and to move on. I want to see who out there still believes that love, even after so much time, still has the power to set us free. In the days that followed, silence filled the house again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It wasn't the suffocating one, the one that reminded me of loneliness and the things I couldn't change. It was a different silence, full of presence, of memories, of a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. His absence was now light, almost sweet, as if what remained was more important than what was gone. But still, there was something I couldn't ignore, the feeling that this story wasn't over. Yet, the nights became long again. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word, every gesture, every look from that reunion. The mind is cruel when it insists on repeating what's already happened, but sometimes it just wants to make sure we understand. And I slowly understood that what he had come to show me wasn't just the past, but a chance to make peace with it. One morning, I received a letter. Yes, a letter, the kind written by hand, with shaky handwriting and the scent of time lingering in the paper. It was from him. Inside, there was only one page, and in it he said he was leaving. He didn't say where to or for how long. He just said he needed to get his head together, breathe new air, understand who he was without the uniform, without fear, without a mask. And at the end, a sentence that left me speechless. If I ever return, I hope there's still an us somewhere. I stared at that sentence for hours. I touched the paper like someone touching an old wound, and I felt the weight and lightness of what it meant. He wasn't running away. He was for the first time trying to find himself, and I knew that, as much as it hurt, it was part of the process. Sometimes, loving someone means letting them go so they can truly come back. The days passed slowly, and I tried to fill the time. I started writing again, something I hadn't done in years. The words began to flow again, as if there was finally room within me for them. I wrote about love, about fear, about lost years. I wrote about the courage to be who you are, even when the world tries to convince you otherwise. And the more I wrote, the more I realized that his story and mine weren't just ours. They belonged to many, of men who spent their entire lives trying to fit into molds that weren't made for them. One day, while walking through the square, I came across a group of young people sitting on a bench. They were laughing loudly, free, carefree. Two of them embraced fearlessly, exchanging a kind of affection that in my time would have been unthinkable. And I felt something hard to explain, a mixture of joy and melancholy. Joy at seeing that the world, somehow, was changing. Melancholy at knowing that for us this freedom had come at a great price. I sat on a nearby bench and watched. And there, in that simple moment, I understood that life has a curious way of remaking itself. What we experience in secret one day serves as a place for others to experience out loud. And this awareness brought me a different kind of peace, as if somehow the pain from before had served to pave the way for other loves to exist without fear. That night, I wrote a final page in my notebook. Love is not a mistake. The mistake is the fear that makes us give up on it. I closed the notebook and slept with a light heart. A few weeks later, I got a call. The voice on the other end was familiar, but tired. It was him. He said he was in a small town in the countryside, that he'd rented a house near the sea, and that he spent his days walking along the beach and thinking about life. Time moves slower here, he said, and I think for the first time, I'm learning to breathe without guilt. We talked for several minutes. He told me he'd been writing too, that he sometimes woke up in the middle of the night to jot down memories that came to him in flashes. He said he wanted to send me some letters, to keep alive the conversation that time had tried to silence. And I accepted. The letters began arriving weekly, some short, some long, but all sincere. He spoke of the sea, of the silence, of the feeling of rediscovering his own body after so many years of hiding within it. And with each letter, I sensed that the man he was becoming was more whole than ever. One day, in the middle of one of his letters, he wrote something I've never forgotten. You know what I discovered? That love doesn't need to come back to be real. Sometimes it just needs to be remembered fondly to keep unexisting. That touched me deeply, because in a way, that's what I felt too. We didn't need promises or happy endings. What mattered was what remained, what time couldn't erase. As the months passed, I began to feel that cycle closing. that the pain from before had become a learning experience and the love a fond memory. There was no more resentment, no regret. There was only gratitude, and a strange sense of freedom, not the kind that comes from doing what you want, but the kind that comes, from finally being at peace with what you've experienced. One night I returned to the beach where I used to walk alone. The cold wind hit my face, and the sound of the waves seemed to whisper memories. I closed my eyes and imagined him there again, smiling, and I realized that love, when it's true, doesn't need a presence to continue existing. It simply changes form. It becomes a memory. It becomes a lesson. It becomes part of who we are. At that moment, I felt a tear fall, but it wasn't of sadness. It was a tear of recognition, of understanding, because life in the end is just that, a series of encounters and goodbyes that shape who we are. When I got home, I sat at my desk and reread all the letters. Some were crumpled, others still smelled of the sea. I put them all in a box and wrote on the outside, things that time couldn't erase. I carefully closed the box and placed it high on the shelf. I stared at it with a peaceful smile, understanding that somehow, this was our way of staying together. If you got this far, comment the word eternity. Because sometimes love doesn't last forever in time, but it lasts forever within us. I want to see who out there believes that there are loves that time can never take away. That night, after putting the box of letters away on top of the bookshelf, the phone rang. "Good evening. This is Marcelo, son of your acquaintance." He said his father's name bluntly. "I'm calling to let you know that my mom passed away today." Silence on my side. Me and my sister, we were with her. I thanked him, wished him strength, and he concluded with a simple sentence. "I thought it was right that you knew." It was the kind of communication that adult life demands. Objective, respectful, without soap operas. The next day he showed up. He came in, sat down, and stared out the window for a few seconds. It's over. There was no drama, no flourish. She left in her own way, silently, without asking for anything. We didn't have a romance. We maintained alliance, and I honored it as best I could. We were silent for a while. There are losses that don't require comment. They require presence. He spoke of the children with restrained pride. Marcelo holds his own. His sister observes everything, says little, but understands my gaze. They both stayed with me until the end. It was a family that recognized each other in the essential, being together when necessary. The conversation, naturally, turned to what comes next. The big house. Doesn't make sense anymore. I'm going sell. I want to be close to Marcelo and the girl, taking them to and from school, having lunch together on Sundays, helping out with whatever I can. It's not an escape. It's about getting my life together. I nodded. It was the solid path. Less square footage, more interaction. I asked about my daughter. Okay. He said it's better for me to have people around than walls. Simple and correct. He didn't ask permission, informed your decision, and the two children supported. He took an old photo from his wallet, his wife holding their first child. He left it on the table. She knew who I was. She asked for respect, work, and care. I gave them. What I didn't have was missing. There was no attempt to absolve himself, just an honest inventory of a life. Men understand this language. Counting, separating, assuming what was left and what was missing. We talked about practical things. Inventory, bills, who gets what. A watch for Marcelo, a ring for his sister, some photos for his granddaughter when she understands the value of their story. I made a list with him, listing the house, sorting documents, updating the address, understanding his granddaughter's schedule, finding a functional apartment near the school and the bakery. Routine is the foundation when everything else falters. When the coffee cooled, he touched on the point that concerns us. I spoke to both of them about you. No speeches. I talked about the past, the respect that remained. What I intend from now on, live without hiding. I asked how they reacted. Normally. No one turned their back. That was enough. We're not at the age to seek applause. We seek I'm calm. Over the next few days he went through the steps like someone methodically breaking up camp. He advertised the house, called his children to choose what to take, and donated what didn't make sense to keep. He sent a short message. Done. Less junk, more air. His objectivity, for once, wasn't defensive. It was peace. He got an apartment 2 blocks from the school. He called me from his new window. From here I can see the girls' school entrance and the smoke from the bakery. The sun hits the table at 8. We laughed. Anyone who's weathered many a storm understands the value of this. Emotional logistics. 3 certainties that tie the day together. On his first Sunday at the new address, he arrived with a bag of bread under his arm. I tested the routine. I left the little one with her dad, went grocery shopping, tidied up the kitchen, walked, read, picked up the bread. It fits, he repeated, looking at me, as if checking the level of a plumb line. I'm fitting. This is the point at which a man understands that the space he lacked most was not in the house. It was within his own chest. We talked about ourselves without a label. There was no need. If we continue to see each other, let it be the right way. Presence, brief words, eye contact, nothing hidden, nothing promised beyond. What is appropriate? I replied. No altar and no basement, only life. He nodded. We agreed on the basics that sustain any adult bond. Tell the truth as much as possible. Arrive on time. Ask for space when needed. Speak up before it gets bitter. Nothing epic. Solid. Before leaving, he stood for a minute in front of the bookshelf. Keep the letters where they won't weigh you down. Neither trash nor trophies. I understood. The past isn't for parading. It's for settle down. When the door closed, I noticed a silence unlike any other. A silence of work concluding, not of stopped work. The following week, life began to spin on a new axis. He'd pick up his granddaughter from school with his backpack on and call me quickly in the afternoon. Bakery? Sometimes he'd come, sometimes he wouldn't. When he didn't come, it wasn't absence. It was life happening. Dinner with the kids, schoolwork, a game on TV. When he did come, we'd break bread at home and chat like men who've learned not to waste the evening with backbiting. In one of these, he blurted out without warning, I should have learned this before. There is no respect without clarity. I replied without sugarcoating it. And there is no clarity without courage. He stared at the bread for a while, then smiled. We arrived late, but we got there on foot. I wrote it down on a piece of paper so as not to lose track. He is a widower. He has 2 adult children who support him. He will live near his family. He has taken charge of his own. Story without fanfare. And among us, the rules of a man apply. Truth, presence, routine. Nothing tighter, nothing looser. Just the right fit. If you followed this far, I want you to comment. Clarity or routine. Tell me which of the 2, so I know where your mind wandered. The need to say what is, or the importance of having the day in place. And if this timeline is now complete for you, write IT fits. This shows me that we can move on to the next step without any loose ends. The days began to follow a new rhythm, one that takes a while for the body to grasp, but the soul recognizes immediately. I saw him more often now. Sometimes he'd come unannounced with the same bag of bread under his arm. Other times he'd simply leave a note on the gate. I passed by, saw the light on. Everything's okay. It was his way of saying he was there, even without needing to say a word. And over time, this simple constancy became what mattered most. It was no longer the reunion, the past, or the memories. It was the routine, the everyday life we come to appreciate when we realize how much we've lost trying to prove what didn't need to be proven. One afternoon, he appeared different. His face was more tired, his eyes sunken. Marcelo was transferred, he said, right after coffee. Good promotion, but far from here. He explained that his son would be bringing his wife and daughter along. The little one cried, said she didn't want to go without her grandfather. He forced a smile, but the emptiness was evident. His house, once full of noise, laughter, and footsteps, was about to be silent again. They asked me to come along, but I don't know. He stared at the cup for a while, as if searching for an answer. I said nothing. I just let the silence do the work. There are times when we don't need to console. Just be there, whole. In the following days, he began walking more. He'd leave early, returning with his hair tousled by the wind and an air of someone reorganizing his thoughts. I'm trying to figure out where I'm going from here, he said once. If I stay here, if I go after them, or if I start over somewhere else. His voice carried a tone I knew well, the one between fear and the need for change. At 60, 70, the body craves calm, but the mind sometimes still wants to start over, and there's no set map for that. Only the courage to take a step and see what happens. One Friday afternoon, he arrived with a briefcase in hand. Inside were some papers. The house, sales contract, the new deed to the apartment, inventory documents, and a folded letter. I'm closing the cycles, he said, with the serene pride of someone who's learned that resolving outstanding issues is the most silent form of peace. He opened the letter and handed it to me. I wrote it to myself. Old age stuff, maybe, but I needed to write down what I've learned. I read it in silence. It was short, but direct. Time doesn't forgive those who live pretending, and true forgiveness only happens when we stop hiding. I kept those words like someone who keeps a manual for adulthood. As the weeks passed, he began to adjust the apartment to adapt to the new phase. He removed the large television from the living room. Too noisy, he said. He placed plants in the window and hung photos of his children and granddaughter. Little by little, the space began to smell like home. Sometimes I'd stop by for coffee, and it was curious how the space reflected what he'd become. Simple, direct, functional. Nothing was left over, nothing was missing. I think I've finally learned to live within myself, he said one day, as he added sugar to his coffee. And that phrase, said almost without meaning to, stuck with me for a long time. Life has a curious way of testing whether we've truly changed. One day he called me saying he'd run into an old police officer, the kind of guy who knows too much about the past. The conversation was strange, he said. He looked at me and asked, "Have you changed? Or are you tired of pretending?" I asked him what he said. He smiled and said, "I said I'm tired, and that sometimes being tired is the most honest way to change." I wondered how much that answer fit him, because deep down, most men don't change. They just get tired of carrying the weight of their own disguise. Time passed, and with it came new routines. He began teaching short self-defense classes at the neighborhood community center, helping the younger generation, telling stories from his time in the police force without embellishing anything. They listened to me with respect, he said, not because I was a police officer, but because I see what they're going to experience. And that was it. He had become a mirror of maturity for a generation that grew up without knowing what it means to age with dignity. They think I teach blows, he joked, but what I really teach is patience. And he laughed, that light laugh that only appears when the soul is in order. One night, after a long walk, he told me he dreamed about his wife. He said she appeared smiling, holding a small suitcase. She told me everything was okay, that I should carry on. He looked at me with a calm look, the kind that needs no interpretation. I think now I can go wherever I want without owing anyone anything. I remained silent. Sometimes silence is the best answer for those who have finally made peace with their past. One day he called me to help organize some boxes. Among the papers and photos, I found one of our old letters tucked away in a book. I thought I'd thrown it all away, he said, surprised. It seems time also preserves what we don't have the courage to erase. We stared at that old, crooked letter, with words that today would seem to be from another language. He ran his finger over the paper and murmured, "It's funny. All my life I thought love was for those who have time. Now I understand it's for those who have courage." I simply replied, "And courage sometimes only comes when time runs out." He smiled, and I knew there was nothing more to explain. That week, Marcelo called to say he was adapting well to the new city, that his granddaughter loved school, and that they missed him. "The house has room for one more," his son said. He looked at me and asked, "Do you think I should go?" I thought for a moment and replied, "It depends. If it's to escape, don't go. But if it's to live, go without looking back." He was silent, then nodded. "Maybe. It's time to go by choice, not by fear." And I knew he understood. In the days that followed, I began to notice a different glow in him. He spoke less of guilt and more of plans. "I want to teach my granddaughter to swim. I want to walk barefoot on the sand. I want to have a relaxed routine without a clock telling me what to do." It was beautiful to see this man, who had once been synonymous with rigidity, rediscovering himself within his own life. His masculinity now took on a new form. No longer one of control, but of care. He didn't need to prove strength, it was enough to exist with truth. Just before his son returned to pick him up, he came to me. He brought an envelope. Inside, a key. "To the apartment. If I don't come back, it's yours. But it's not about inheritance, it's about trust." I looked at him and asked, "Do you think you'll come back?" He replied with a calm smile, "I don't know. But if I don't come back, I've already left everything in order." And in that moment, I realized how rare it is to grow old consciously. Most people leave behind debts, hurts, or silences. Not him. He was leaving. Clarity. The last night before departure was peaceful. We sat on the porch looking at the sky. He said, "It's funny. Life started to make sense when I stopped trying to understand everything." We laughed. Sometimes that's how it is. Meaning only appears when we stop seeking logic and start accepting what is. I thought the end would be heavy, he added. But look, it's light. And he sat there quiet, watching the wind rustle the leaves on the street. When he left, there was no speech, no promise, just a firm handshake, the kind that speaks volumes. "Take care," he said. "You too," I replied. And the rest was in his gaze, a gaze of someone who understood that life doesn't have to be perfect to be true. If you got this far, comment the word true, because that's what this story is about men who, after so long trying to be what the world dictated, finally chose to be who they are. And tell me in the comments, in your opinion, what's harder, asking for forgiveness or accepting forgiveness when it arrives? I want to read your answer, because the next chapter begins right there. Time passed, more than I imagined. Sometimes life changes silently, not with major events, but with small absences that we only notice when the clock insists on reminding us. The first few weeks after he left were strange. The house seemed bigger. The sound of the gate seemed emptier. Breakfast took longer. There was always that feeling that he would appear at any moment with the same bag of bread and the calm manner of someone who carries the world without fanfare. But time is wise. It doesn't erase. It just accommodates. And that's how, little by little, the memories began to fit within the days. The letters stopped arriving in late autumn. The last one spoke of the sea. It said the tide was calm. The wind carried the scent of ancient mornings, and his granddaughter was learning to swim. "When she dives," he wrote, "the world seems to go silent." I think that's what I've always sought. A moment of peace underwater, where nothing needs explaining. I read that phrase so many times I memorized it. To this day, when I go to the sea, I repeat it quietly as if it were a prayer. The following months were marked by a new calm. I began writing again, but not about him, nor about the past. I wrote about what was left: courage, silence, respect. I wrote about aging, with dignity, about accepting what was without bitterness. And perhaps without realizing it, I began writing about myself, because, deep down, that story was never just his. It was ours. It belonged to all men who, at some point, have had to choose between what the world expects and what their hearts demand. One day, walking through the square, I met the postman. He recognized me from afar and said, "I have something for you." It was a small envelope, yellowed with age. The shaky handwriting was still his. I sat on the bench and opened it right there. The letter was short, almost a note. "If this message reached you, it's because the sea took me for good. But I want you to know that I went in peace. I took the right memories with me, the wrong ones I left here, for you to turn into history." I stared at those words for minutes. The wind blew, and the page trembled in my hands. It wasn't sadness I felt. It was gratitude. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't make a fuss. He simply said goodbye the way he'd lived these past years. Direct, calm, and with a truth that only those who have looked into their own mirror can grasp. I folded the paper, put it in my pocket, and stood there, looking up at the sky, feeling a tear well up. After that, I started visiting the sea every now and then. Not as if searching for someone, but as if visiting a part of myself. I walked along the sand and remembered the conversations, the silences, the glances that spoke more than 1,000 words. Each wave I crashed seemed to wash away a piece of the weight I once carried. Because forgiveness, true forgiveness, isn't an event. It's a process. It happens inside us, until one day, you realize it no longer hurts to remember. The following years were good, peaceful. I saw the world change. I saw people learning to be freer. I saw parents embracing children who, in our time, would have been disowned. And whenever I witnessed something like this, I thought of him. I thought of how different things would have been if we had been born in another era, one where love didn't need to disguise itself to survive. But what we experienced, even with the fear, also had greatness, because in the end, we were what we managed to be. And that, for those who survived shame and silence, is more than enough. One morning I ran into Marcelo. He recognized me first. He came to me with the same look as his father, a mixture of serenity and strength. "My father spoke a lot about you," he said. The stories he told me made me understand a lot of things I'd previously misjudged. We talked for hours. He told me about his granddaughter, about how his father had spent the last few months feeling lighter, more human, speaking openly about everything. He said he'd finally made peace with time. I smiled. Yes, he has, I replied. And he left that as a legacy. Marcelo handed me a sealed envelope with his name handwritten on it. He asked me to deliver it to you personally. Inside was a photo, the two of us, old, sitting on the porch, drinking coffee. And on the back, a short sentence. You were the piece of life I truly lived. I didn't need anything else. I put the photo in my pocket, and for the first time in a long time, my chest felt light. Since then, I've never looked for explanations again. I learned that life is made of passages, not possessions, that we don't lose those we love, we carry them with us, and that aging, in the end, is this, learning to be grateful even for the pain, because it's what shaped us. Today, when I wake up and look at my reflection in the mirror, I see a whole man, a man who doesn't hide what he's experienced, who isn't ashamed of what he's felt, and who understands that love doesn't diminish anyone. On the contrary, it humanizes. Every now and then, I still get messages from people who heard this story and say it made them think. Some write to say they finally had the courage to call someone from their past. Others say they've started to look at themselves with less guilt. And that's when I realize everything I've experienced, everything I've suffered, everything I've forgiven, has served a purpose. It's served to show that time may age the body, but when the soul decides to free itself, it rejuvenates. In the last letter I wrote, not to him but to myself, I included a phrase that sums up everything I've learned. Dignity lies not in those who have never fallen, but in those who have had the courage to get up and continue here, walking with a clean heart. And that's what I try to do every day. Keep walking with a heart at peace. If you've stayed with me this far, let me know. Write the word in the comments. Dignity if you believe that a man's true strength lies in recognizing his own vulnerability. Or comment time if you also understand that sometimes it is time, and not forgiveness, that heals what we thought would never pass. And if this story touched you in any way, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Because in the end, what truly keeps us alive isn't what we possess. It's what we can feel without having to hide it. And this story, like life itself, continues.